Hey guys, tonight we're plunging deep, like ice pick deep, into one of history's frostiest fixations. Imagine you're crunching across a snow-dusted field at Mount Vernon, your breath puffing out in soft little clouds, your wool mittens damp from hauling yet another chunk of translucent ice into an underground vault. Above you, a tall, silent figure watches with solemn pride. That's George Washington. And yes, the man is weirdly obsessed with cold storage. This story starts where all good bedtime history tales should, with dessert. Washington wasn't just a face on your dollar bill, he was a man with taste. And in colonial Virginia, nothing screamed sophistication louder than a scoop of something frozen in July. Ice wasn't just about staying cool, it was power, prestige, and in George's case, maybe even a coping mechanism. You probably won't survive this, by the way. Not the story, this life. Because back then, summer without refrigeration was a slow, sticky descent into culinary despair. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, drop your location and the time where you're listening from in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're 10 years old, barefoot, walking up a muddy road in Westmoreland County, Virginia, and the year is 1742. Little George Washington, he's 10 too, is just ahead of you, kicking at pebbles and swatting at clouds of gnats. You're heading toward a plantation home where, rumor has it, a rare treat is being served, iced pudding. Frozen custard. In summer. This might as well be magic. The moment is small, almost forgettable. But for George, it sticks like a sweet drip of something frosty sliding down the side of a silver bowl. You watch his eyes widen as a butler lifts the dessert's porcelain lid. Cold smoke curls upward. It's a taste of the impossible. Historians still argue whether this childhood moment directly influenced Washington's later obsession with ice. But we know this: his life slowly filled with strange, meticulous acts to recapture that exact sensation. By his early 20s, George had already begun journaling the weather like it owed him rent. He noted temperature fluctuations obsessively, scribbling down even the faintest chills with almost poetic precision. A cloudy day in July? Worth noting. A breeze from the north? Worth measuring. It's like he could feel the future importance of understanding temperature, and maybe, controlling it. You stand with him now as a young officer during the French and Indian War. The air is thick with swampy heat. His wool uniform scratches your neck as he mutters about the unwholesomeness of heat. A fellow officer offers tepid water from a leather flask, and Washington grimaces like he's been handed soup in a sauna. There's something deeper happening here. He doesn't just enjoy cold. He reveres it. You start to see that George doesn't merely tolerate the discomfort of icy logistics. He dreams of conquering it. Of mastering nature's fridge. Fast forward a few years, you're in his study at Mount Vernon. His pen scratches steadily, the fire crackling behind you as he writes about ice again. He's heard about English lords preserving river ice in straw-insulated pits. He wants one. No, he needs one. He sketches a primitive version of what will soon become his pride and joy, the Mount Vernon Ice House. Think of it like a colonial walk-in freezer carved into the ground, with drainage, ventilation, and walls that could survive a small cannonball. Quirky tidbit here: Washington's personal obsession with ice likely started before any of the other founding fathers caught on. Benjamin Franklin was busy flying kites in storms. Thomas Jefferson was still dreaming in French. But George was plotting the perfect summer sherbet delivery system. You help him read letters from London merchants, begging them to send special molds for freezing creams, pewter spoons that won't stick to your lips, and even imported Neva River ice cutting techniques. He's all in. But here's where it gets charmingly weird. He isn't just installing an ice pit. He's dreaming of a whole frosty empire. He begins to track the taste of cold. Ices made with Madeira wine, he mutters one night. Might pair well with roasted duck. You blink. He's talking about menus now. Whole cold season feasts. He becomes fixated with texture, how crushed ice affects the density of lemon punch, how packed snow might cool wine more delicately than ice blocks. You feel like his sous chef in a glacial test kitchen. Still, the obsession doesn't bloom overnight. It creeps in. And you begin to realize something else. For Washington, ice isn't just about pleasure. It's about order. Control. In a world where war, disease, and rebellion run rampant, cold is the one element he can preserve, contain, and use to command all. It's around this time he starts casually offering frozen fruits to guests in the middle of July, just to watch their eyebrows arch. You get the feeling he lives for that reaction. We know for a fact that George ordered ice cream pots from abroad, custom-made molds and tin freezing kits. The guy built what basically amounted to a private Arctic vault in the humid hills of Virginia. Even now, standing in that hand-dug chamber, the walls slick with condensation, you feel the cool dampness seep through your shoes. It smells like moss and stone and iron ambition. And yes, we also know he wrote with startling detail about his ice needs, enough that one historian once joked he could have written a colonial cookbook titled Frost and Freedom. One last detail before you drift off tonight. Washington's very first recorded batch of imported ice was packed in sawdust and shipped in barrels from a frozen creek more than 30 miles away. It arrived partially melted. His reaction? Build a better ice house. Because when it came to frozen comfort, General Washington didn't surrender. You trudge up a slope at Mount Vernon with a muddy shovel in one hand and frostbitten fingers barely holding a bucket in the other. Washington's first proper ice house is under construction, and you're part of the team. Lucky you. It's the 1780s, and you're helping to dig a hole that's less like a pantry and more like a secret portal to Antarctica. The blueprint's pretty straightforward. Carve out a cylindrical chamber in the earth, line it with stone, and insulate it with straw and sawdust so tightly that not even July can ruin its chilling magic. You stand back and stare into the pit, which smells like churned-up clay and fresh ambition. Washington is beside you, hands behind his back, mentally calculating slope gradients and drainage angles like a man designing a frozen time capsule. The exact site? Down near the riverbank, convenient for hauling ice chunks in winter, and out of direct sunlight. He's thought of everything. This is no haphazard hole, it's engineering theater, and Washington is the star architect. Historians still argue whether he designed it entirely himself or copied from similar British estate models, but his obsessive oversight left little room for improvisation. He didn't just want an ice house, he wanted the ice house. You help lay the base stones. Each one is hauled in by ox cart, wiped clean, and carefully nudged into place with something like reverence. And when the pit is lined, the dome comes next, a hand-formed brick roof, arched like a chapel for the cold. The floor slopes gently to a drainage tunnel, because Washington, in his ice-fueled genius, knows melted runoff will ruin everything if it pools. You feel the temperature dip as the structure begins to close in. A primitive kind of refrigeration is coming to life, and you, in all your shivering glory, are part of it. It takes weeks. Through snow and sleet and one minor landslide, which George records with calm irritation, the ice house rises, sinks, into place. Quirky moment, one afternoon, a guest at Mount Vernon nearly falls into it while looking for the outhouse. Washington, embarrassed but polite, has the door redesigned and camouflaged with shrubs. You swear you hear him mutter, "This is a vault, not a privy." Once complete, the new chamber is roughly 16 feet deep and 12 feet wide, large enough to hold thousands of pounds of ice. Washington doesn't celebrate with a ribbon cutting. Instead, he orders a test run. "Just to measure integrity," he says. You suspect it's really an excuse to stash away his summer wine early. The first delivery of ice arrives midwinter. You're with the laborers, dragging enormous blocks across frozen terrain. They groan under the weight, the sleds creaking like dying whales. The men wrap each block in burlap and hay, stack them with methodical precision inside the pit, and coat the whole icy mess with layers of sawdust. George stands by the opening like a man inspecting treasure. He lowers a small thermometer in by rope. His brow furrows. Then, the faintest smile. Victory. Now comes the good part. Summer hits with a fury: mosquitoes, melted wigs, humidity thick enough to chew. But Washington's dinner guests are sipping chilled claret and spooning strawberry ice cream. You serve it to them, straight from a silver dish still frosty from the vault, and watch the expressions: awe, disbelief, envy. "Wherever did you keep this?" one man whispers. Washington simply gestures vaguely toward the south lawn. You smirk. The ice house is hidden under a cluster of ornamental shrubs. Like a Bond villain's secret lair, but for sorbet. This moment? It's more than culinary smugness. It's a performance of power. In a time when rot and spoilage rule the table, Washington can defy nature itself. The ice house isn't just a fridge, it's a flex. Even Martha gets in on it. She asks the enslaved cooks to try chilling leftover mutton, just to see what happens. Cold meat in August? Scandalous. At this point, Washington is no longer just maintaining his frozen stash, he's expanding. You help him add a second, smaller chamber for overflow storage. Some say he even considered building another at his presidential residence in Philadelphia, though evidence is murky. Historians still debate whether that design was his or influenced by Jefferson's European ideas about glaciers. But here at Mount Vernon, he's king of the cold. You help catalog his stash: trout wrapped in paper, barrels of butter, dozens of cream pots, and even a chilled bottle of cherry bounce, a homemade liquor Martha supposedly mixed herself. You notice something else as summer rolls on. Washington visits the ice house like it's a meditation chamber. He'll check the sawdust levels, test the temperature with that same little rope thermometer, even sniff the air to check for mold. Sometimes he doesn't say a word. Just stands there in the doorway, nodding to himself. You'd swear he gets emotional. This isn't storage, it's a philosophy. And it's working. Ice lasts into September, sometimes October. Guests gasp when a frosted bottle of cider appears on the table long after the last snow. One time, Washington quietly pulls you aside to show you a perfectly preserved bunch of grapes he stored, just to see if it could be done. And you start to understand, this isn't weird anymore. It's genius. And yes, maybe still a little weird. He calls it practical civility. You call it early American refrigeration science. Either way, the man who led armies is now commanding condensation, and honestly, you're impressed. As you settle down near the now closed vault, the crickets chirping around you, the night air cool and damp, you realize this is just the beginning. Washington isn't done freezing things. Not by a long shot. You're fanning yourself with a linen napkin at a garden party on the Mount Vernon lawn. It's July, and the Virginia heat is making your powdered wig feel like a slow-roasting casserole. But then, salvation arrives. A footman glides past with a tray of chilled wine, the glass sweating with perfect beads of condensation. You glance sideways. George Washington gives you the tiniest nod. It's not just refreshment. It's a flex. Because in this world of wilted collars and spoiled meat, ice equals power. And Washington, the general-turned-gentleman farmer, knows it. This is the dawn of cold as a status symbol. You sip your wine and listen as another guest, some lesser plantation owner who's definitely trying too hard, drops a not-so-casual brag about a small ice hole I've just had dug. Washington, cool as the drink in your hand, just raises an eyebrow. That's the social equivalent of a slap with a chilled glove. You wander into the parlor, still sipping, and notice the portraits, the rugs, the precise placement of imported furniture. But nothing in this room carries quite the same awe as that unspoken reality. George can serve you something cold in summer. And not just anything: peaches chilled in cream, Madeira wine just above freezing, even some experimental London sorbet that tastes like the Enlightenment itself. Historians still argue whether ice culture in colonial America began with Washington or simply bloomed around him, but there's no question that Mount Vernon became ground zero for the cold arms race. Owning an ice house didn't just mean comfort. It meant you had the resources to spare, laborers to dig it, servants to maintain it, a system of luxury logistics few could match. And here's the kicker: unlike fancy wigs or imported books, you couldn't fake an ice house. There were no shortcuts. Either you had it or you didn't, and if you did, it meant you had serious economic gravity. Washington, ever the strategist, understood this long before it became fashionable. You sit next to him as he reviews his guest list for an upcoming dinner. He doesn't just ask who's coming, he wants to know who's never had frozen dessert before. You realize he's staging a kind of sensory coup. Let them taste something impossible, he mutters. Even Jefferson gets caught up in the trend. Later, when you're in Monticello, you hear him prattle on about his own elaborate ice pit, inspired by France and frosted ambition. Jefferson wants it to be efficient, aesthetic, and maybe even philosophical. You just want your drink to stay cold. Still, you can't help but compare. Jefferson's vault is elegant, but Washington's? It's industrial. Brutal. Made to outlast heat, war, and time itself. You begin to notice that guests often make excuses to, accidentally, glimpse the Mount Vernon ice house. Washington never brags, but he never stops them either. And while others dip their toes into ice culture, Washington dives in. You help him review receipts for specialty goods, metal tongs, imported molds, barrels of sawdust, all shipped at great expense. He's not just maintaining a frozen stash. He's scaling it. One hot afternoon, he gives a tour to a curious young officer. As they pass the garden, the officer gestures toward the concealed entrance to the ice house. Is that some kind of bunker? Washington smiles faintly. In a manner of speaking. Then, with a glint in his eye, he adds, It preserves what must not be lost. You wonder if he means fruit, or something more. Here's your quirky tidbit. Washington didn't just store food in the ice house. He also preserved rare plants, experimental seeds, and once, allegedly, a small sample of imported snow shipped from New England just to see if it behaved differently. You weren't there, but you've seen the entry in his ledger. 2 barrels, experimental snow, volatile. That's not the kind of phrase you forget. There's even a rumor, though no historian will swear by it, that he once tried to chill a set of freshly tailored gloves. Just to see how they felt after an hour. This is the same man, remember, who meticulously charted how long a candle burned in different weather. You're dealing with the original freeze nerd. But power always has a cost. Behind every frozen delicacy you serve to dinner guests, there's the hidden army of enslaved workers who made it possible. They cut the ice in frigid January waters. They hauled it up the slope in freezing rain. They packed it tight in the vault, layer after layer. You remember the frostbite on young Elias's fingers, the hacking cough from river exposure, the silence when someone asked about the help. You feel it in the silence after the guests leave, when you help clean up the silver dishes and the servants quietly shovel out melted ice into the dark soil. Washington, to his credit, or perhaps to his shame, doesn't ignore the labor. He records it, accounts for it, even pays for extra burlap to keep the men warm. But he never questions the system. The cold, for all its purity, is still built on inequality. You linger by the ice house one twilight, the lantern flickering in your hand, listening to crickets and the soft hiss of summer heat pressing against the earth-covered dome. You know what this is now. Not just a freezer. A monument. A metaphor. A strangely elegant weapon in a social game where cold equals control. As the last light slips behind the hills, you understand why Washington built it the way he did, not just deep and thick-walled, but hidden. Let the guests marvel at the chill without asking too many questions. Let them praise the peaches, the cream, the wine. They won't see the shovels. They won't feel the frostbitten hands. But they'll remember the taste. And that, for Washington, is the point. You're peering over a polished punch bowl at a gathering of titans, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, even Franklin, and each one of them is arguing about the Constitution and sorbet at the same time. Welcome to the Cold Club, unofficial but very real, where frozen delights are both a pleasure and a flex. And standing quietly at the edge of this frosty fray? George Washington, savoring a spoonful of iced apricot like it's a diplomatic maneuver. This is where ice stops being a novelty and starts becoming a language. These guys aren't just founding a country, they're competing to see who can chill dessert better. Historians still argue whether Washington, Jefferson, and Madison consciously used ice as a status weapon, or whether they just really liked their wine frosty, but either way, the obsession spread like gossip in a colonial salon. And you? You're stuck passing tiny bowls of frozen raspberry mash to men who are writing your national blueprint between bites. Jefferson, predictably, turns it into a science. During his time in France, he falls in love with French glaciers, stone ice houses buried into hillsides and insulated with straw, and brings the idea back to Monticello like it's the secret to immortality. You later help him dig one that looks suspiciously like Washington's, only with a fancier door. You and George exchange a long look when you visit. You both know the truth. Jefferson's version is a knockoff. Tasteful, yes, but it lacks the brutal utility of Mount Vernon's ice vault. His is for show. George's? That's for legacy. Still, Jefferson is bold. He starts writing down recipes, actual frozen recipes, in a little notebook, most of which end up becoming early American ice cream canon. One particularly warm evening, you find yourself licking a spoon of iced asparagus custard, while he lectures on Enlightenment philosophy. The dessert is questionable. The vibe is impeccable. Meanwhile, James Madison is taking notes from both men. He builds his own modest ice pit, not flashy, not fancy, but reliable. The Switzerland of colonial refrigeration. He's less interested in showing off and more curious about long-term food storage for survival purposes. You help him wrap cheese wheels in canvas and lower them carefully, and for a moment you think, maybe he's onto something. Even Hamilton gets in on it, though he's more about drinks than desserts. You're at a tavern with him once when he brags about his pre-cooled whiskey, like he invented the concept. You roll your eyes, but you can't deny, iced spirits hit differently after a sweaty walk through Philadelphia. Back at Mount Vernon, Washington takes it all in. He's not competitive in the loud way. He's competitive in the quiet, terrifying way, the already did it, improved it, moved on kind of way. You find yourself alongside him one evening as he tweaks the ice house vent system based on something he read in a French agriculture manual. He doesn't say it out loud, but you know he's aiming for the coldest internal temperature of any founding father. He even has you test the internal temperature 3 times a day during the summer, morning, noon, and dusk. You keep a little slate for numbers. George reviews them like a hawk. He'll murmur, tapping the chalk. We're losing a degree at high noon. Needs more sawdust layering. He's not joking. Quirky moment. During a diplomatic dinner with a French envoy, Washington serves a chilled plum custard topped with shaved ice. The envoy, visibly stunned, asks how it was made. Washington simply replies, with a little planning. The poor man spends the rest of the night pacing the garden, trying to figure out if he's been shown up. You just refill his water and enjoy the fireworks. But diplomacy isn't all dessert. Washington begins quietly sharing advice on ice house design with allies. You catch him mailing a drawing to Governor Morris, complete with detailed measurements and insulation notes. Must slope downhill for drainage, he's written in blocky script. It's like sending a blueprint for how to build a freezer in a war zone. Some argue Washington saw this as a small contribution to national stability. If every state governor could preserve food longer, store medicine, or simply feel a little less dependent on the British import chain, it was worth it. Others say it was vanity. Still others say, why not both? And here's the whisper in the background. Not everyone loved the Cold Club. The southern elite, especially those in deeper inland regions, considered it a waste of labor and resources. You remember one dinner where a Georgia planter scoffed. Let the Yankees eat snow. Washington didn't even blink. He just poured the man a perfectly chilled glass of cider. The insult melted faster than the ice. In a rare moment of reflection, you catch George staring into the darkened mouth of the ice house one late August night, sipping something golden and slow. They think it's about indulgence, he says. But one day they'll see. It's about foresight. You're not sure if he means dessert or the Constitution. Probably both. Later that fall, Washington writes a letter mentioning how Frozen articles may serve not only delight but also aid in preserving the health of one's household. He's starting to sound like an 18th century wellness blogger. You don't mind. His peach sherbet is excellent. And while Jefferson keeps writing about culinary refinement and Madison talks about food security, Washington just keeps improving. You help him install thicker doors, better hinges, a tighter seal on the trapdoor. The cold mustn't leak, he mutters one morning. You nod, knowing full well he's not just talking about temperature. So there you are, watching this chill-based bromance unfold, ice houses sprouting from Monticello to Montpelier, chilled politics trickling through every summer gathering. It's strange, yes? But also kind of beautiful. A secret club of Enlightenment nerds trading blueprints for the future, one frozen delicacy at a time. And as the sun dips behind the Blue Ridge, you lean back on the porch, cold cider in hand, listening to them bicker gently about whether apricot preserves hold up better than cranberry ice. You smile. The Republic may be fragile. But the sorbet? Solid. You're up before dawn, boots crunching over frostbitten grass, and you're already dreading the ache in your shoulders. Because today, like so many winter days at Mount Vernon, you're heading down to the river to start cutting ice. And no, you don't get a thank you card. Just a set of rusty tongs and a stern warning not to drop the block on your foot again. This is the part of Washington's icy obsession that no one toasts at dinner, the grueling, bone-numbing labor done almost entirely by enslaved workers. You glance over at them now, heads bowed against the wind, hauling saws and barrels. Washington may have designed the ice house, but they make the cold real. You wade into the shallows. The ice is thick but unpredictable. It cracks in long, groaning lines under your boots, and you can't stop your teeth from chattering. One slip, and it's a quick trip to hypothermia, or worse. Each block is carved with heavy iron tools that, let's be honest, haven't changed much since medieval times. There's no steam-powered anything. Just manpower, back muscles, and the distant possibility of frozen peaches in July. Historians still argue whether Washington saw the irony, his high-minded Enlightenment pursuits fueled by the unpaid labor of people whose names rarely made it into the record. What we do know: he documented everything else, dates of ice collection, quantities hauled, and temperatures checked. But the names of the people who actually did it? Mostly silence. You haul your first block onto a wooden sled. It's slick, heavy, and biting cold. Two men, Elias and Josiah, grab the other end, grunting as the sled starts its journey uphill toward the ice house. This will repeat 100 times before sundown. Washington sometimes comes down to observe. Never with idle hands, he'll take notes, make adjustments, and on occasion, offer warm cider to the workers. You watch him one morning sketching improvements to the sled runners while a boy half your age coughs uncontrollably beside a stack of melting ice. Efficiency, he mutters. You wonder if he means for the ice, or the people. Here's the quirky tidbit you'll never forget. Washington once tried using woolen blankets instead of sawdust to insulate the blocks. Might prolong surface freeze, he theorized. You help unwrap them weeks later. Verdict? Mold. Deeply fuzzy mold. Washington scribbled, wool ineffective, and moved on. The blankets were burned. Once the ice makes it uphill, it's time for the real artistry. You join the team as they lower blocks into the pit, stacking them like frosty bricks in a temple to preservation. Sawdust is packed between each layer to prevent sticking and insulate the structure. It itches like madness. You'll be scratching for days. Washington watches from above, squinting into the darkness. He doesn't just want ice to last through summer, he wants it to last months. Sometimes into fall. He's planning for droughts, for unexpected guests, for presidential contingencies, maybe even for war. Ice is no longer indulgence. It's preparedness. And while it may seem extravagant, the truth is this: every plantation owner worth their salt was now copying him. What once seemed eccentric had become gospel. But none matched Washington's intensity, or his logistics. Every time a new batch arrives, the process repeats. You're the one marking barrels, helping assign rotation order, labeling contents with charcoal. Oysters, cream, wine. Even a small basket labeled simply M seeds. You don't ask. You walk with Elias one evening after a long haul. His hands are raw and pink, nails cracked from the cold. Man builds a house for ice, he says flatly. But not for us. You don't know how to answer that. So you don't. That night, Washington writes in his journal. The vault appears sound. Ice remains in good form. Quantity sufficient for season. No mention of who carved it. Who carried it. Who bled for it. But here's a quieter truth. Those workers knew the system better than Washington ever could. Josiah once reorganized a stack to preserve the best blocks deeper in the vault. Elias invented a sling made of rope and fabric to reduce splintering during transport. You tried it once yourself. Saved you a finger. You see now, the laborers weren't just bodies. They were the engineers of this system. They knew which trees dropped the best insulating leaves, how to time the haul between weather shifts, how to check for black ice under the snow. Washington had the vision, but they had the knowledge. And yet their stories are ghosts. When tourists come to Mount Vernon years later, they'll marvel at the craftsmanship, the endurance of the ice pit. They'll sip chilled cider on walking tours and nod thoughtfully at the innovation. Few will ask who made it possible. Quirky side note, Washington once tried to set up a small rotation of reward days for the enslaved ice crew. They could rest, tend personal gardens, or visit family on other properties. But the policy ended quickly. The labor demands outlasted the goodwill. Ice waits for no one. One cold February evening, you help unload what will be the last batch of the season. The wind howls over the Potomac, and the lantern light flickers. Your boots slip twice, and Josiah swears under his breath. Washington appears, wrapped in a thick wool coat, nodding at the progress. Excellent, he says. We'll have peach brandy chilled by June. You nod, too exhausted to say what you're thinking. Because for you, and for the men beside you, this isn't about dessert. It's about surviving another season in the shadow of a luxury you'll never taste. And somewhere beneath the frost, that truth sits heavier than any block of ice you've ever lifted. You're standing at the edge of the Potomac River, boots sinking into slush, watching a cluster of men chip, saw, and lever massive blocks of ice onto wooden sledges. This is no quick errand. This is logistics on the scale of a military operation, hauling frozen water across a landscape that seems designed to sabotage you. Washington's ice obsession didn't just require ingenuity. It demanded a wintertime ballet of oxen, wagons, rope, and prayer. And you? You're right in the middle of it, praying hardest of all. Because once the ice is cut and packed with sawdust, the clock starts ticking. This stuff melts. And there's no refrigeration truck waiting. No backup freezer. Just you, a team of exhausted laborers, and miles of muddy road between the riverbank and that cool, hungry vault. Historians still argue whether Washington's transport techniques were influenced more by British estate practices or naval logistics. But either way, what he pulled off was advanced for the 18th century. You're basically running a refrigerated supply chain with 1770s technology, and a complete lack of mercy from the weather. Every trip is a gamble. Too slow, and you arrive with slush. Too fast, and the horses break a leg on the ice-slick slope. One time, you help rig a canvas tarp soaked in brine, hoping it'll reflect sunlight. It doesn't. The ice still sweats like a sinner in church. You remember one especially brutal haul through sleet. Elias, leading the oxen, loses his footing and nearly gets crushed under the load. He doesn't cry out. Just mutters, "Ain't no peach worth this." You keep walking. Washington occasionally joins the convoys. Not to work, exactly. He's not the kind to grab a saw, but to observe, correct, calculate. You've seen him call for a detour around a shaded hill that he insists is 1.3 degrees cooler. You scoff, but follow. Later, the load makes it with far less melt. The man was right. And while this may sound like overkill, you have to admit, it works. Each successful haul is a small miracle. And he records everything. Wind direction, time of day, slope angles, snow depth. It's like he's building a cold weather Bible, one scribbled entry at a time. Quirky moment? One of Washington's wagons once lost a wheel mid-journey. Instead of turning back, the crew buried the blocks in a nearby hillside under pine needles and marked the tree with a red X. A week later, they returned to find the ice nearly intact. Washington was so pleased, he spent half a day drafting ideas for satellite storage nodes. Yes. He invented ice caches. By now, you've got a system. Ice is cut in sheets, broken into carryable blocks, wrapped in straw or burlap, loaded onto carts, and pulled uphill toward Mount Vernon. It takes at least 4 men per load, sometimes more. The ropes burn your palms. The wagon wheels seize in the mud. But when the ice vault door swings open and that cold breath rolls out, you feel a little victorious. One summer, Washington tries something bold. He instructs you and a small team to attempt a long-range ice import from the Shenandoah Valley. The higher elevation, he reasons, might produce colder, purer ice. It's 3 days by wagon. You go. You freeze. You curse. You also fail. Half the shipment melts on day 2. The rest arrives as cloudy puddles and soaked straw. Washington simply nods, makes notes, and says, "We try again next year." He's not discouraged. He's data gathering. And the storage isn't even the end of it. Once inside the ice house, it's all about placement. Washington has rules: newer blocks on the outside, older on the bottom. Sawdust must be checked every few days. You help implement his ventilation management schedule. Yes, there is a schedule. By now, your hands have calluses in the shape of rope grooves. You've become an expert in judging when ice is clean break versus soft edge. You know the signs of premature melt. You know how to tell when a load is doomed before the oxen even start walking. One night, as you're sweeping straw off a melting pile that didn't quite make it, Washington approaches silently. "What was the delay?" he asks, not unkindly. "Bridge near Dogue Run flooded," you say. "Lost 2 hours rerouting." He nods. "We'll fortify the lower crossing." You blink. He's already sketching the bank layout in the dirt with a stick. And yes, he keeps dreaming bigger. You overhear him discussing ways to create a reflective ice cover using polished tin. You help him test it. It blinds you in the sun and melts nothing. Still, the attempt is logged in the ledger. Failure is just frozen progress. Washington's dream isn't just about ice. It's about permanence. Cold is order. Cold is control. In a world full of chaos, wars, weather, disease, ice is the one element he can harness, direct, and keep exactly where he wants it. One day, he even muses about the possibility of moving ice by boat. You imagine a barge filled with frozen blocks, covered in hay, sailing serenely up the Potomac. It sounds insane. Until, centuries later, someone does it. Washington was always about 2 steps, and 2 centuries, ahead. There's something almost spiritual in the final stage. The moment the ice is packed in its resting place, you and the others stand back. The chamber breathes frost. You close the heavy wooden hatch and brush snow off your shoulders. It's done. All that pain, precision, and planning, for a few moments of frozen luxury months from now. But you understand. Washington's not just storing ice. He's storing time. Capturing winter and sealing it in stone, so summer can't take everything. And as you walk back downhill, muscles aching, fingers numb, you wonder if there's something deeply human about it. This need to preserve what should melt. To hold on. Even just a little longer. You're bent over a wooden prep table in Mount Vernon's kitchen, the air thick with the smell of cream, nutmeg, and raw oysters. You wrinkle your nose as the cook cheerfully stirs a pot of something that looks both delicious and a little dangerous. Across the room, Washington leans over a tin mold, carefully examining a half-frozen custard. "Let's try the Madeira next," he says without looking up. Welcome to his chilly culinary lab, where cold is more than preservation. It's experimentation. By now, the ice house is fully stocked. And Washington, never one to let resources sit idle, has turned from storage logistics to culinary creativity. You glance at the menu for tonight's dinner and see a few familiar items: iced punch, chilled berries, frozen cream. But then your eyes snag on something that makes you pause. Iced oyster pudding. You look at the cook. He just shrugs. His Excellency likes variety. Historians still argue whether Washington developed these oddball frozen dishes on his own or borrowed them from imported cookbooks. But either way, his kitchen becomes a stage for chilled drama. Ice isn't just survival anymore, it's flavor, texture, performance. You help the staff crank a heavy wooden sorbetier, a kind of hand-powered churn buried in salt and ice. The recipe? Lemon, honey, a splash of brandy, and a secret Martha ingredient you're pretty sure is vinegar. Your arms ache. Your knuckles go numb. But when that soft, tangy scoop hits your tongue, you admit, it's totally worth it. And Washington? He's not just eating. He's tasting. Judging. Thinking. There's a particular frown he reserves for under-churned ice cream. You've seen it before, usually followed by a muttered note in his kitchen ledger. Too soft. Adjust salt. Here's your quirky tidbit of the day. Washington apparently had a fondness for frozen drinks served with whole sprigs of mint. A little flourish that today would scream craft cocktail. But back then just made people blink suspiciously. One guest described it as a strange cold punch with garden garnish. You watched her sip it, hesitate, and then quietly ask for a second glass. As summer intensifies, the kitchen turns into a frozen fantasy factory. The cooks are trained in layering cold and warm textures on the same plate: roast fowl with a chilled citrus glaze, venison served with nearly frozen cranberry sauce. You once helped plate a trout that had been brined, smoked, and then, somehow, lightly iced before serving. It made exactly one guest cry. Washington was always meticulous, but in the kitchen, his attention to detail goes next level. He measures serving temperatures with a tin thermometer, comparing chilled wine against melted ice, taking notes like a professor. You help him time the window of optimal frost, a 20-minute period between perfectly firm and tragically soggy. And it's not just dinner guests who benefit. You remember walking into the servants' quarters one July evening to find a modest bowl of cold berry mash left for the kitchen staff. Washington's way of saying thanks, maybe? Or testing another blend? Hard to tell. But you savor it in silence, the cool sweetness like a soft exhale after a long, hot day. Even the drink menus evolve. Washington starts requesting chilled cider with a hint of clove, or Madeira cooled just enough to take the edge off the heat. You help construct a makeshift cold well by burying bottles in a trough of salt-packed ice. The trick? Don't let the glass touch the sides, it'll crack. Learned that one the hard way. Then comes the July banquet, the big one. A dozen guests, outdoor seating, lanterns strung from trees, and every course featuring something chilled. Martha insists on a centerpiece made entirely of frozen fruit. You and Elias work for 3 days carving tiny pineapples and grapes out of ice. The whole thing melts within 20 minutes, but still. It was glorious. The piece de resistance? Ice cream. Not just one kind, 4. You serve them one by one: peach with honey, blackcurrant with ginger, chocolate with chili, and a terrifyingly experimental celery mint combo that makes 3 guests cough into their napkins. Washington loves it. That one's surprising, you offer politely. Refreshingly agricultural, he replies with a grin. It becomes a pattern. Every week, something new, something cold, something risky. And the guests keep coming. Foreign dignitaries, local officials, curious travelers. All eager to taste the icy sorcery they've heard whispered about across taverns and salons. Washington understands the power in it. He's not just feeding people. He's shaping their memory. No one forgets the first time they taste true ice cream in the sweltering Virginia sun. No one forgets chilled strawberries on a plantation porch in July. It's like witnessing a magic trick performed with patience and powdered sugar. And it's working. Mount Vernon becomes more than a political estate. It's a place where cold happens. where impossibility is spooned into silver dishes and passed across candlelit tables. One night, after the guests leave and the plates are stacked, you sit by the open kitchen window, sipping a glass of cold apple cordial. The stars are out. The cicadas hum. The only thing colder than your drink is the air wafting up from the ice house down the hill. You smile. Because while war, politics, and storms rage elsewhere, you've found yourself in the middle of a peaceful revolution, one that tastes like blackberry and lemon and frost. And maybe a touch of celery. You're elbow deep in a barrel of melting ice water, trying to rescue a soaked map of New Jersey, when it hits you, this is not how they teach logistics in military school. But George Washington, the general who turned cold storage into a personal crusade, was never one to leave ice behind when he went to war. You're about to find out what happens when the battlefield meets the ice vault. From the moment the Revolutionary War begins, Washington's passion for freezing things doesn't exactly go on hiatus. In fact, he tries to take it with him. You're there when he first asks the question no one else dared to. Can we preserve ice during campaign movements? The other officers blink. You nod. You've seen the man's face when ice cream shows up after a long ride. You know this is serious. Historians still argue whether Washington genuinely believed ice could be a viable tool of war or if it was just another luxury he couldn't let go of. But either way, you're the lucky one assigned to portable chill box construction. Spoiler, it's a box, lined with straw and misery. You're stationed at Morristown in the winter of 1780, and it's so cold your breath turns into icicles midair. Washington has you and a few others attempt a frost harvest, cutting lake ice and storing it in makeshift bunkers dug into the snowy hills. Emergency cooling reserves, he calls them. You call them glorified snow holes. One block actually makes it through spring. You present it to him like a child bringing home a report card. He presses his hand to it and mutters, "Useful, should heat stroke become widespread." He's not kidding. By mid-war, Washington is looking for ways to apply his cold obsession to troop welfare. You're tasked with placing barrels of partially melted ice near the mess tents. Cooling stations, he says. The men use them more to wash off grime than to cool off, but still, it's progress. Here's your quirky tidbit. In one forgotten field order from 1781, Washington supposedly asked his quartermaster to secure any glacial deposits found near the encampment, a phrase that made its way through the ranks as code for "Don't let the general's cider get warm." Of course, the problems pile up fast. Ice is heavy. It melts. Horses hate dragging it. Soldiers would rather carry ammo than snow cones. Still, Washington persists. He even encourages a small ice pit near Valley Forge, an experiment that ends in a mudslide, a ruined turkey stash, and one very angry quartermaster. You remember helping shovel slush out of the food tent. That smell stayed with you. But it's not all failure. You help field test a small portable cooler made from wood, tin, and salt brine. It holds exactly 1 bottle of wine or, as you quickly discover, a handful of berries. For morale, it's a godsend. Officers stop by the cooler like it's a tavern. Only the frostiest for our general, they joke. And there's something poetic about it, too. Washington isn't just trying to keep wine cold. He's trying to bring a sliver of control into the chaos. The war is brutal. The camps are filthy. But if you can hand a man a cold apple on a July afternoon, he might believe, just for a moment, that things aren't totally falling apart. One time in the field, you stumble across Washington crouched beside a hastily dug pit, inspecting a small stockpile of ice someone buried beneath straw. It's laughably primitive. But his eyes light up. "You think it'll hold till next week?" he asks. You squint at the dripping pile. "It might last 2 days." He nods thoughtfully. "Then we must eat faster." You don't laugh. Neither does he. There's an ongoing debate among modern historians about whether Washington's wartime cold obsession had any measurable tactical effect. Some say it was a sideshow, a quirk. Others argue it was early military logistics in action, an attempt to regulate diet, reduce spoilage, and even prevent heat exhaustion during forced marches. One letter from an aide mentions storing ice-cold cloths to press against soldiers' necks in midsummer. It sounds like a spa day, but in 18th century warfare, that counted as battlefield medicine. And yes, there were misfires. You remember a botched plan to ship snow in barrels to a distant camp. The snow turned to water, the water turned rancid, and the entire supply train was repurposed to carry turnips. Washington did not speak for the rest of the day. Still, he keeps trying. You see it in his travel orders, in the strange little footnotes about insulated containers and preferred shade routes. You once rode ahead of the column to scout trees that might provide 5 minutes of extra shade for a rest stop. Anything to keep them from boiling over, Washington said. You weren't sure if he meant the cider or the men. And through it all, you start to appreciate the madness. Ice, in this context, isn't a frivolity. It's a symbol of calm. A reminder of home. A tiny, defiant middle finger to entropy. One evening, after a rare victory, the camp cooks managed to serve a pitcher of chilled punch, barely cool, a little too sweet, but still. Washington holds up his glass and quietly says, "Let the French have their champagne. I'll take this." You clink mugs. The fire crackles. Somewhere nearby, a cannon fires in the distance. But for this moment, the air is cool. The drink is cold. And the general is smiling. You're flipping through one of Washington's worn leather-bound journals by candlelight, fingers numb from the cold, and there it is again, another line about temperature. 25 degrees at dawn, wind from NNW. Nothing else on the page. No troop movements. No dinner notes. Just the weather. And you suddenly realize, this man is tracking everything. Especially the cold. At first, it seems like a harmless quirk. You've seen him note the dew point on days when no one else even notices the sky. But over time, the pattern becomes undeniable. Wherever he is, whether at Mount Vernon, on campaign, or hunkered in a wind-blasted tent, Washington is recording the temperature like it's the pulse of the universe. Historians still argue whether he picked up the habit from his surveyor training or if he adopted it later as part of his Enlightenment leanings, but either way, the man is a walking weather app in powdered wig form. You're there the day he receives a new thermometer imported from England, long, fragile, expensive. He handles it like a holy relic. The wrapping barely hits the floor before he's testing it in the shade versus the sun, comparing it to his older one, and muttering about calibration discrepancies. You help him set up a tracking station outside his study window using a crude shelter to protect it from direct exposure. Yes, Washington builds a thermometer house. Of course he does. His entries become startlingly consistent. He logs sunrise temperatures, midday heat, wind direction, frost dates. You help him draw a rudimentary graph showing ice availability over the winter months. He even tries to predict how long his supply in the ice house will last based on early March averages. Spoiler: he's scarily accurate. Here's your quirky tidbit. In one of his journals, Washington casually mentions a sensation of coolness that does not match the thermometer reading. You remember that day, it was cloudy, damp, and oddly refreshing. The entry ends with a speculative note. Humidity? Or misreading? This is 1790. The man is basically discovering wind chill. Over time, he starts using his data to make decisions: when to harvest crops, when to close off parts of the house to conserve warmth, even when to schedule certain public appearances. You once overheard him decline a meeting with a visiting official, due to an unfavorable barometric trend. The official just blinked. You nodded solemnly. Washington begins writing letters inquiring about the temperatures in other colonies. Has ice yet formed in Williamsburg? One note asks. Another. What is the date of the latest frost in Albany this year? You half expect him to commission a colonial version of the Weather Channel. By the late 1790s, he's borderline obsessed. You're tasked with helping organize his ledgers, and you find he's cross-referenced crop yields with ice longevity, wine clarity, and even foot traffic through the main gates. The man is building a climate database with quill and ink. You wonder sometimes what he's really after. Maybe it's control, or maybe it's fear of the unknown, the unregulated, the heat that ruins peaches before they can be preserved. In a world where death could ride in on a breeze, knowing the wind's direction felt like armor. One morning, you catch him sitting silently in the orchard, staring at the trees, thermometer in hand, not writing anything, just observing. When you approach, he says, "It will freeze tonight. The ice house must be readied." No question. Just certainty. You glance up at the sun, which still feels warm, but sure enough, frost settles by midnight. And this isn't just a Mount Vernon thing. During his presidency in Philadelphia, Washington has you help him rig a small weather station on the grounds. Nothing fancy, just a thermometer and a wind vane. Still, he insists on daily recordings. You store the notes in a drawer labeled atmospheric. He tells you to watch the shadows around noon, they shift before the temperature does. You do. He's right. Again. Guests begin to notice the habit. "Does the president always ask about the weather before the State of the Union?" One British ambassador jokes. You just smile and pass him a cup of chilled cider. Some days, the logs read like poetry. Sharp air from the river, the grass holds silver. Other days are dry as dust. 34 degrees, wind east. All still. But always, there's the subtext. You're not just observing nature. You're trying to bend it to your will. Ice isn't just frozen water. It's a way to organize the chaos. You remember a rare evening where Martha teases him. "You'll have us sleeping in the ice house next." He doesn't laugh. Just says, "It might be more comfortable come July." And while his contemporaries dabble in temperature records, none match his thoroughness. Jefferson records lunar phases. Franklin writes about lightning. Washington? He just keeps logging the cold. He even has theories, wild ones. The behavior of the trees may indicate early snow. Fog along the river suggests a coming thaw. You write them down because he asks you to, and because, over time, you start believing them. And here's the kicker. Years later, climatologists would use his notes to track long-term temperature trends in early America. That's right, your frostbitten diary duties helped birth American climate science. Go figure. So now, every time you see him quietly step outside, glance at the sky, press his fingers to the windowpane, you know what he's doing. Measuring the world. Taking its pulse. Looking for signs that the ice will last. And maybe, just maybe, trying to freeze time. You're crouched on the floor of Washington's study, trying to relight the fire after one of his infamous ventilation experiments, left the room feeling like a root cellar. He's at his desk, sleeves rolled up, eyes bright, holding 2 thermometers, one in each hand, as if they might start talking. "This one," he says, tapping the longer one, "reacts quicker but less reliably." You nod. It's the 3rd time he's told you this. This is the phase where ice obsession collides with enlightenment science. And Washington? He's elbow deep in both. By now, you've stopped asking why the general is collecting mercury. Or why he's measuring the air temperature every 15 minutes like he's trying to win a prize. The age of reason has arrived in America, and Washington wants in, preferably with something cold in hand. Historians still argue whether Washington genuinely thought of himself as a man of science, or simply liked surrounding himself with the illusion of it. But if you've ever seen him weigh snowmelt in a tin pan, you know, this was personal. It all starts innocently. He orders books from London, treatises on physics, agriculture, and temperature theory. You help unpack them, noticing titles like A Discourse on the Utility of Cold in the Preservation of Provisions and Observations on the Freezing of Spirits. Yes, spirits. He's especially interested in whether strong liquor freezes differently than water. Guess who gets to test it? Here's your quirky tidbit. One foggy December morning, Washington mixes 3 cups of cider with varying levels of alcohol, buries them in snow, and checks them hourly. His conclusion? Fortified spirits resist frost longer but offer no advantage in taste. You write it down. The footman next to you mutters, That's a waste of good brandy. But it's not just drink experiments. Washington starts building cold traps, wooden boxes filled with ice and salt, to see how quickly they can freeze small containers. You assist as he dunks eggs, cream, even strips of venison into brine solutions to track their reactions. One time, he tries to cool a sealed tin of gunpowder. You back away. He does, too. He records everything. Salt ratio to freezing depth, time from melt to spoil, air movement's effect on frost. You swear he's about to invent a refrigerator 2 centuries early. It's not far off. He does sketch a crank-powered ice churn that looks suspiciously like an ice cream machine with ideas above its station. One sunny afternoon, he brings out something truly bizarre, a glass jar with a brass stopper and a little crank on top. This, he says, may simulate freezing rain. You blink. Why would we want to do that? You ask. He shrugs. To know it better. You nod and silently pray you don't get electrocuted. And then comes the mercury incident. You're helping clean the study when a small vial tips over. The silvery liquid snakes across the floor like something alive. You freeze. Washington is instantly at your side, scooping it up with a feather quill, muttering about waste and volatility. He's not angry, just annoyed that his measurements might be off. After that, he stores his mercury in a locked drawer. He still checks it every other day. Just more carefully. And while the experiments are mostly domestic, some have grander aspirations. You're there the day Washington drafts a letter to a colleague in Philadelphia describing a theoretical vault of perfect preservation. In it, air temperature remains constant year-round. No thaw. No rot. A place, he writes, where time may slow, if not stop entirely. You stare at the letter. The phrasing chills you more than the ice house ever did. He starts calling his study the observatory. Half joking, half serious. You install little shelves to hold jars, pipes, funnels. One evening, he calls for you to suspend a slice of meat near the hearth, while cooling another outside, to measure decay rates. That's the night you go to bed smelling like lamb stew and sawdust. But here's the thing, Washington wasn't doing this in a vacuum. Across the Atlantic, scientists in Europe were diving into similar territory. Boyle, Fahrenheit, even Lavoisier were experimenting with cold as both a state and a weapon. What makes Washington unusual is how he blends it with everyday life. For him, the Enlightenment wasn't confined to laboratories. It seeped into his gardens, his kitchen, even his cellar. The ice house became not just a storage tool, but a control group. And you? You're the underpaid research assistant who somehow never gets credit in the footnotes. Guests begin to ask about the curious devices at Mount Vernon. You've seen more than one dinner party pause so Washington can explain how dew forms or why snow is brighter than ice. One man whispers, "Is he always like this?" You nod. Only when he's awake. Still, there's a warmth beneath the frost. Washington invites curious minds to help. Local boys come by to watch the churning experiments. A traveling schoolmaster once stays an extra day just to tour the vault. And when a visiting merchant donates a rare Swedish thermometer, Washington thanks him with a frozen peach cordial. No one forgets it. One summer, you help test a theory, whether the vault can delay fruit ripening. You suspend apples from strings, monitor the color, weigh them weekly. The result? Slight delay. Significant firmness. Washington is thrilled. You get the first bite. It tastes like apple. Slightly colder. But that's not the point. Because the point, as you finally realize, is control. Predictability. Washington isn't just a farmer or a founder or a foodie. He's a systems guy. The world spins out of control, storms, revolts, death, and he's trying to slow it down with graphs and frost and a handful of snow-packed jars. One night, he tells you quietly, "If we know the cold well enough, we need not fear the heat." You're not sure if he means weather, politics, or time. But you write it down anyway. Because it sounds like something people might quote, years later, on the walls of a very cold museum. You're tiptoeing through the dim, echoey basement of the presidential mansion in Philadelphia, lantern flickering against the stone walls. The air smells of damp wood and faint citrus, and somewhere ahead, you hear the quiet clink of bottles shifting in storage. You've seen ice houses before, but this is an underground fortress of frost. And you're pretty sure George Washington is hiding something behind that stack of Madeira. By now, it's the 1790s, and Washington isn't just freezing things at Mount Vernon. He's brought the chill to the Capitol. Literally. As president, Washington has the weight of a newborn nation on his shoulders, but that doesn't mean he's willing to eat lukewarm dessert. He arranges for a smaller version of his beloved ice vault to be constructed beneath the executive mansion. It's no Mount Vernon masterpiece, but it does the job. You helped design it, after all. A deep-walled chamber, lined in stone, packed with straw and sawdust. Discreet. Efficient. And invisible to most visitors. This is a political building, after all. It wouldn't do to brag too loudly about luxury when the country is still trying to figure out if it can even pay its debts. But cold storage? That's not indulgence, it's necessary to ensure proper hospitality. At least, that's what Washington says with a straight face. Historians still argue whether the Philadelphia Ice House was ever fully operational during his presidency or remained more of a conceptual project. But if you've ever ducked into that basement and touched the frost on the Madeira bottles, you know, it was real. And surprisingly well stocked. You remember the day the first ice shipment arrived from a nearby farm, dragged through city streets in barrels, packed tight with pine shavings. People stared. One newspaper wag joked that the president was building a second treasury, this one for snow. But Washington doesn't laugh. He's focused. He's got a rotation schedule tacked up beside the wine shelf, complete with little hand-drawn symbols for caution, slush. You once asked if he wanted to color-code them. He said he was strongly considering it. The cold room in the basement quickly becomes one of the most controlled spaces in the city. In an era before reliable thermometers were commonplace, it is one of the only rooms in the presidential home where you can predict the atmosphere hour by hour. And Washington treats it like a sacred chamber. You catch him down here late at night sometimes, running his fingers along the wall, checking for moisture. Once, you find him reading by lantern light, sitting on an upturned crate next to the cider barrel, sipping slowly. It's easier to think in the cool. He mutters. The contents vary depending on the season. Barrels of root vegetables. Bottles of port. Dishes of jellied fruit. Once he attempts to store a ham. In suspended cold. It emerges 2 weeks later with an unsettling sheen and a smell you don't speak of again. Not all experiments are wins. But others are brilliant. Cold butter in August. Preserved cherries in December. Chilled cream for presidential breakfasts. You once prepare a dish of frozen figs for a visiting diplomat from Spain. He nearly weeps into his handkerchief. Quirky tidbit for today, Washington wrote a personal memo reminding himself to rotate the egg casks weekly. No one knows exactly why, since the eggs weren't supposed to be down there in the first place. But he was convinced it preserved their brownness. He may have invented the concept of egg maintenance. Of course, the staff starts whispering. The president's wine vault. They call it the secret cold box. You hear one maid say she wouldn't step foot in there alone after dark. It's too quiet. Like it's waiting. You laugh, until you step in alone one night and swear the air is different. Still. Alert. Washington doesn't mind the mystery. If anything, he cultivates it. You once see him lead a senator down for a private tour. The senator, already half pleading for a cabinet appointment, stares into the darkness and murmurs, "This is impressive." Washington just nods. No sales pitch. Just cool confidence. And you know the truth, this is a strategic space. The cold storage isn't just about food. It's about control. Reliability. The one room in the presidential house that always behaves exactly as expected. When visitors marvel at the chilled cider or the preserved cream, Washington says nothing. He lets the experience speak for itself. In a city of unpredictability, riots, political turmoil, outbreaks of yellow fever, his ice stash becomes a tiny pocket of order. Unchanging. Untouched. And during the fever epidemic of 1793, that cold room becomes something else entirely. You help move cloths soaked in ice water upstairs, pressing them to fevered foreheads. Some say it helps. Others just feel grateful for a small relief. Either way, the ice house becomes a kind of refuge. One evening during that terrible summer, you find Washington sitting alone on a bench beside a block of ice that's slowly steaming in the heat. Everything else is chaos, he says softly. But the cold stays the same. He doesn't say anything else for a long time. Just watches the frost fade. Historians would later call him a man of restraint. Of calm reason. But you've seen what fuels it. The quiet obsession with structure, the longing for permanence in a world that melts under your hands. The ice house in Philadelphia isn't just a luxury. It's a philosophy. And as you turn to leave, the cool air brushing your neck, you know that philosophy is still alive, packed behind a wall of straw and stone and a lifetime of frostbitten dreams. You're crouched beside a four-poster bed at Mount Vernon, holding a bowl of rapidly melting ice, and trying to wring out a linen cloth without dripping it onto your boots. George Washington is burning with fever, his breathing ragged, his skin flushed and damp, and the doctor beside you nods toward the ice bowl. "Apply it again," he says. "We must keep the heat from overwhelming the system." This is the moment where the myth of ice as power turns into something else: medicine, desperation, hope. Because in the 18th century, when most treatments involved bloodletting, leeches, and prayers whispered through gritted teeth, ice was one of the few things that actually felt like it helped. Historians still argue whether cold compresses during illness were a widespread medical practice or simply part of a scattered set of Enlightenment-inspired home remedies. But at Mount Vernon, ice was absolutely considered medicinal. You've watched it used to soothe headaches, ease the heat of sunstroke, and bring down the fever of a child who'd fallen ill after running too long in the August sun. In Washington's household, the ice wasn't just tucked away for peaches and punch. It became a sort of emergency reserve for bodies, not just food. Quirky tidbit: Martha once asked you to chill handkerchiefs in the ice house before dinner on a sweltering day. Not for fashion, but for pressing against guests' temples. Delightful, one woman sighed, as if you'd handed her eternal youth. You just try not to show how many stairs you'd had to climb with a tray full of semi-frozen rags. And yet, there's something strangely modern about it all. The way Washington turned to cold not just as a luxury, but as a form of treatment. You helped apply chilled compresses to aching joints. You watched small trays of fruit kept cold for the sick, in the belief that spoilage might worsen a fever. You even helped one of the housemaids try icing a cut with packed snow wrapped in muslin. "Stops the swelling," she said, like she'd discovered the laws of physics. Washington didn't invent this idea, but he absolutely believed in it. And in a world without penicillin, clean hospitals, or even reliable thermometers, belief mattered. You recall one especially harrowing night when a guest, some colonel from New York, collapsed in the sitting room with sunstroke. Washington personally supervised as you ran back and forth to the ice vault, hauling chunks wrapped in cloth. "Not too cold," he warned. "We need to cool him, not shock him." The colonel recovered. Barely. But he never forgot the sensation of frost on his neck during a night that could have gone very differently. And it wasn't just about fevers. You once overheard a conversation between Washington and a visiting physician discussing the effects of temperature on melancholy. "The mind is clearer in the cold," the doctor said. "As if one could freeze off despair." You thought it sounded ridiculous, until you spent a day sitting in the vault after the death of your brother. And for a few minutes, surrounded by stillness and frost, the grief paused. Not gone, but quiet. During his presidency, Washington carried some of these ideas north. In Philadelphia, you helped set up what was effectively a proto-first aid corner in the cellar ice room: linens, wine, vinegar, and ice ready to be used at a moment's notice. He believed in readiness, not just for politics, but for bodies under stress. Of course, not every cure worked. Washington once tried icing a sprained ankle with chunks packed in molasses. You have no idea where he got that idea. It was sticky. And awful. And the bees were very interested. The lesson: sugar and cold don't mix unless you're making dessert. One of the more heartbreaking uses for ice came in the form of cooling the dying. It wasn't uncommon to see bowls of ice placed by a person's bed in their final hours, not to save them, but to ease the burning in their final breaths. You were present once, during a neighbor's last hours. The room was quiet, the windows open, the only sound the slow drip of melting ice into a basin as his family whispered prayers. And Washington, he never forgot those moments. He believed in dignity, in stillness, in a kind of grace that came with quiet coolness. You think that's why he never allowed the ice house to become purely utilitarian. It was always more than storage. It was solace. And yet there were limits. When he falls ill for the final time in December 1799, ice is used again. His throat swells, his voice fades. You're sent to the ice vault, rushing through snow to retrieve blocks wrapped in burlap. They're applied to his neck in turns, then traded out, then reapplied. The doctor mutters about inflammation, but you already know, it's not helping. Not this time. Washington himself waves the cloth away eventually. Not out of discomfort, but because, even in dying, he doesn't want anyone wasting effort on something he knows can't reverse what's coming. Still, he lets it stay in the room. A basin of ice at the foot of the bed. Slowly melting. Even as he loses strength, there's something comforting about the cold. The steadiness of it. The small, unchanging nature of something so fragile. You wipe his brow with a chilled cloth one last time, and for a moment, he breathes more easily. He opens his eyes. He nods ever so slightly. And you realize something. For Washington, ice wasn't just a fascination. It wasn't even about science or status anymore. It had become a kind of language, a quiet defiance against decay, disease, and death. A belief that with enough planning, enough preparation, enough frost, you might be able to ease the end. Maybe not stop it, but slow it down. Long enough for one more breath. You're standing ankle-deep in sawdust, nose full of the earthy musk of old wood and damp stone, helping Washington measure the inner curvature of a wall for, what else? Another structural adjustment to the ice house. He wants the ceiling reinforced. Again. Not because it's collapsing, but because he wants it to feel more sealed. More permanent. You don't say anything, but you're starting to suspect that for Washington, this isn't a food vault anymore. It's a monument. By now, the ice house isn't just part of Mount Vernon's architecture, it is its own character. Quiet, sturdy, mysterious. Hidden beneath the hillside like a buried crown jewel. You've led visiting guests to it under strict instructions not to make a show of it. But Washington always knows when someone's seen it. He can read their faces, equal parts awe and confusion. He takes pride in that. Pride in their bewilderment. You once heard him murmur, "They understand I can hold on to what melts for others." Historians still debate whether Washington's obsession with his ice house reflected a deeper desire for legacy control, or if it was just a rich man's pet project. But you've seen the way he treats it. How he lingers at the entrance. How he brushes sawdust from the latch like it's the hinge on a vault filled with gold. It's more than utility. This place means something. You remember the first time he used the word preservation with gravity. "We must preserve not only the harvest," he said, "but the rhythm of a civilized life." A glass of chilled wine in July wasn't about indulgence. It was about demonstrating mastery over time, over nature, over decay. You're there the day he adds a brass ring to the inner door frame, just so it seals tighter. He checks it twice. Then has you oil the hinge until it swings silently. You half joke that he's treating the thing like a tomb. He doesn't laugh. Quirky moment. Washington once tried to commission a miniature model of the ice house, hand-carved, to scale. When the artisan asked whether it was for educational use, he replied, "For reflection." You saw it once, tucked in a drawer, its tiny door frozen shut with dried sap. Every winter, as the ice is hauled in, the process becomes almost ritualistic. The tools are cleaned, the path cleared, the labor coordinated with the precision of a state dinner. Washington walks the full route, tracing it like a priest preparing for ceremony. "We lose less melt each year," he notes, satisfied. He begins making small improvements with each cycle. Vent flaps. Double insulation. A clever little drainage ditch lined with pebbles. "To keep it dry even in death," he says. You're not entirely sure he means the ice. And what he stores there starts to shift. It's no longer just cream and cider. It's seeds from plants he refuses to see wilt in summer. It's letters he sealed in wax and hidden among the straw. One year you find a pewter box tucked between wine casks. Inside? A folded map, a feather quill, and a single silver spoon. No explanation. You begin to see that the ice house, for him, is more than a place. It's an identity. A reflection of who he wants to be remembered as: steady, enduring, cool-headed. The man who didn't just lead armies or write letters, but who held fast against heat and time and entropy. You catch him sketching once, not maps, not troop formations, but potential upgrades to the structure. He even entertains the idea of expanding it laterally. "Should our children desire more room," he says, "for colder futures?" You think he's joking. He's not. And then there's the way he talks about it to others. Never directly. He doesn't brag. He lets the idea drip. At dinners, he mentions the unmelted stock. At tea, he asks gently if guests have tasted truly cold berries. "Still sweet," he adds. "Still whole." And they look at him like he's performed a miracle. There's one visitor, a scholar from Boston, who walks the grounds with Washington and later writes, "He showed me many things, his fields, his stables, but lingered longest near a mound of earth, which he described not as a whole but as a promise. That was the ice house. Of course, there are those who mock it. A folly, one critic calls it. The man built a palace for perishables." Washington never replies publicly. But privately, he upgrades the door latch again. You help with the upkeep every year. Clean the drainage. Inspect the vent. Adjust the slope of the straw. And over time, you notice something. Washington doesn't seem to want the ice to last forever. Just long enough. Long enough for the summer. For the guests. For the taste of a chilled cherry in the mouth of a man who rode 30 miles through heat to shake his hand. Long enough to show that mastery is possible, if only briefly. And eventually it dawns on you. This was never just about frozen cream or cold cider or keeping oysters fresh. It was about memory. It was about preserving what shouldn't survive. And in that way, the ice house wasn't just a structure, it was Washington's private cathedral. A temple to the possibility that, with enough walls, enough sawdust, enough care, you could resist the inevitable. Not defeat it. Just delay it. Just long enough to leave behind something that feels permanent. And that's when you realize you're not just maintaining a vault. You're maintaining a myth. You're standing by George Washington's bedside, holding your breath as he struggles through another coughing fit. The fire crackles softly. The room smells faintly of vinegar, ash, and something sour you can't quite place. Maybe illness, maybe fear. Outside, the December air howls through the trees. And somewhere beyond the house, the earth above the ice house is frozen solid. Untouched. Waiting. This is the end. And strangely, cold has returned, not as a luxury this time, but as a quiet companion. By now, you've spent years watching Washington use ice to master his world. He preserved food, softened suffering, soothed fevered skin, and even turned frozen cream into political theater. But now, as he lies still and pale, the cold is no longer something he wields. It's something he must face. Historians still argue whether ice was truly present in the room during Washington's final hours or if it was simply brought in during the earliest phase of his illness to try to bring down his rising fever. What's confirmed is this: he was sick, and quickly. He woke on December 13, 1799, with a sore throat. By nightfall the next day, he could barely speak. You were there. The doctors came fast, 3 of them, each with their own pet theory and favorite method. Bleeding, blistering, purging. You watched, helpless, as Washington endured it all with his usual grim determination. But you also saw him request something. Not medicine. Not more blankets. Ice. Bring from the vault, he whispered. You ran. Not because it would save him, you knew better, but because when George Washington asked for cold, it meant something. It meant dignity. It meant clarity. It meant he was trying to hold the line, even here at the edge. And so you brought it, crates wrapped in straw, chunks of last winter's harvest now trembling in the weak firelight of his room. You crushed it gently in cloth, applied it to his throat, let the cool drips soak into the linen around his neck. He winced, then sighed. You don't know if it eased the pain. You only know it was the last thing he asked for that wasn't spiritual or legal. A whisper of control. You noticed, too, how the household stilled around the ice. As if it brought silence with it. Martha sat by the bed, her hand in his, not moving, just watching the frost melt in the bowl beside her. Quirky detail, he kept a silver spoon by his bedside. Not for medicine. But you remember him once telling a guest that silver holds the cold longer. You wonder if he meant to use it for one last taste. You find it untouched. Later that evening, when the final breath left him, the room didn't erupt. It quieted. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fire and the drip, drip, drip of meltwater into a pewter dish. And suddenly, all that cold, the vaults, the experiments, the dinner parties, it didn't seem odd. It made sense. Washington had spent a life trying to hold back what slipped away. Heat. Time. Decay. He couldn't stop death. But he could meet it on his terms, composed, chilled, orderly. Afterward, the house filled with whispers and rustling black cloth. The funeral was planned. Carriages arrived. The guests wept. You kept working. You went down to the ice house and checked the seals. Not out of duty, habit. Washington's death didn't stop the cold rituals. In fact, they took on a new shape. You helped preserve his favorite food items as a kind of symbolic gesture. You stored some brandy cherries. In his memory. You even helped a visitor collect a jar of Mount Vernon snow from near the vault. Something about taking it back to Boston, as if it carried his essence. But the strangest thing happened that winter. The ice in the vault lasted longer. You checked it daily, expecting the usual January slump, the wet seep into the straw, the soft hiss of meltwater dripping onto the stone. But the blocks held. Week after week. Sharper edges. Less runoff. You joked about it at first, said maybe he'd chilled the earth itself. Then you stopped joking. Because deep down, part of you felt it too, the general had left his mark. Not just on the nation, but on the cold itself. The vault didn't just preserve ice. It preserved him, his precision, his obsession, his refusal to let the natural world unravel unchecked. You once caught Martha standing by the vault, wrapped in shawls. She wasn't speaking. Just resting her hand against the door. He always checked it twice, she said. Even when no guests were expected. You nodded. You remembered. And you helped keep it going. The new stewards asked you to maintain the same schedule. Rotate the straw. Inspect the seals. Keep the blocks stacked the way he liked them, old ice on the bottom, new on top. Just as he designed. Just as he preferred. It became a ritual. Not just for food, but for remembrance. And slowly, others caught on. Visitors to Mount Vernon began to ask about the famous ice house. They expected cream, maybe cider. But you told them the truth. That it wasn't about flavor. It was about control. About holding on. About legacy. You took them down into the vault. Let them touch the frost on the walls. Watch their breath turn to mist. And you'd say, quietly, this was his favorite room. And you weren't lying. Because for George Washington, the ice house wasn't just a storage place. It was a reflection of everything he believed, that with enough work, enough will, and a little well-timed frost, the chaos of the world could be managed. Not forever, but for long enough. You're standing in the sunlight outside the Mount Vernon vault, hand resting on the weathered wooden door, when you realize people still come here looking for the man. Not the general, not the president, but the human being who tried to trap time beneath a mound of Virginia soil. And what they find, more often than not, is a story told in frost. After Washington's death, the ice house becomes a relic, but one that never quite stops breathing. It survives brick by brick through centuries of storms, wars, and careless maintenance. Even when the estate falls into periods of neglect, someone, you, often enough, makes sure the vault stays sealed. Dry. Waiting. And the guests come. Scholars, schoolchildren, curious tourists with cameras. They come looking for stories of victory, of battle, of revolution. But what captures them most is the tale of a man who cared deeply, weirdly, about cold fruit in the middle of July. Historians still argue what it all meant. Was it vanity? Vision? Was it control? Was it a comfort, a distraction from the fragility of life in an unsteady republic? Or was it, perhaps, just a man's way of making a little magic last longer? One modern writer called the Mount Vernon Ice House America's first great freezer, which is not entirely wrong. But the truth is colder and deeper. It was Washington's attempt to outpace mortality, to steal a piece of winter and hold it long past its season. A rebellion against rot. A declaration that he, George Washington, could bend even the laws of nature to his will, at least for a few months at a time. And his legacy? It really did stay on ice. Because decades later, long after the man himself is gone, Americans begin building ice houses in earnest. Inspired by examples like Mount Vernon's, and fueled by entrepreneurs who start hauling ice from frozen northern lakes to cities across the eastern seaboard, the ice trade becomes a thing. A huge thing. By the mid-1800s, whole industries emerge: ice wagons, ice cutters, ice boxes. Cold becomes commerce. Ice becomes an expectation. You help your neighbors dig one behind their barn. You see public buildings add cooling cellars. You even help a young man named Frederick Tudor measure snow density. He'll go on to ship ice as far as India. Quirky detail? The Tudor family once sent a letter to Mount Vernon, inquiring about Washington's insulation techniques. "We heard his ice stayed firm till September," they wrote. You don't remember if anyone ever replied, but you smiled when you read it. And as the years pass, people begin preserving him, too. Not just his letters and swords, but his presence. His likeness is frozen in statues, in paintings, in the memory of every schoolchild who's ever heard of a cherry tree or a frigid river crossing. He becomes an icon. Stiff. Formal. Cold. Maybe too cold. Because that's the final twist, isn't it? Washington spent his life mastering chill, not just in his food, but in his manner. In his leadership. In his careful silences. In his refusal to show anger, to show fear. People called him aloof. Marble. A statue even before he died. You know better. You saw the spark when he cracked ice for wine. You heard the pride when he described the perfect preservation of strawberries past harvest. You felt the urgency when he raced the sun to save one more block from melting. He wasn't cold. He was obsessed with cold. And that obsession outlived him. Today, replicas of his ice house exist at Mount Vernon and beyond. People take tours. They peer into the dark stone belly where the past once slept beneath sawdust. Docents explain how food was stored, how labor was used, how ice was hauled. But the real story? The strange, delightful, haunting one? That takes longer to tell. You sometimes want to stop the tour groups and say, "He didn't do this just to serve dessert. He did this because he believed, deeply, that some things are worth preserving, even if they melt anyway." And isn't that the whole point of legacy? Not to prevent decay forever, but to delay it. To resist it. Just long enough to be remembered. Now the story slows. You step back from the door of the ice house, the shadows curling along its frame, the day's warmth finally pushing through the trees. The grass is soft underfoot. Somewhere far off, a bird calls, drowsy, like you. The air is calm. Inside the vault, it's dark and cool, even in the heat of summer. The smell of stone and wood and something almost sweet still lingers. The silence in there is different, thicker. The kind that wraps around you gently. The kind that asks for quiet. You picture George Washington standing where you now stand, taking in the chill, running a calloused hand along the doorframe, thinking, perhaps, not of battles or speeches, but of peaches, of wine, of time, and how it slips, and how, just maybe, he's found a way to keep part of it still. It's strange, isn't it? That a man who led armies, who crossed frozen rivers under cannon fire, who held the weight of a nation's birth in his hands, might also find meaning in a bowl of frozen cream, in a room designed to hold winter itself, in something so simple, so human. And maybe that's why we remember him. Not just because he built a country, but because, in a quiet, moss-lined vault beneath his estate, he tried to hold on to the impossible. Not forever. Just long enough. Just like us. Now let your eyes grow heavy. Let the cold fade to quiet. Let the sound soften. You've seen the frost, you've carried the ice, you've walked with the man. And now you can rest.